Catherine the Great, Chapter 6. While the man made up the fire, Paul rose and stretched. He paced about the room, peering at the books and the various ornaments that his mother had kept about her. He looked around when the servant politely spoke. "Will there be anything else, Your Highness?" "Make sure you come to me immediately there is news of the Empress," replied Paul. The footman bowed and quietly left the room. Paul turned again to his mother's diaries. Moscow, September 30th, 1762. I am certainly glad the coronation's over. The bishop seemed to think it's essential that I go without food for 3 days beforehand. The coronation itself took a whole afternoon, and I had to stand there wearing all those purple cloaks and carrying the great heavy scepter. The cathedral was full of people and so hot I could hardly stand. The music was deafening and the bishop droned on and on. I thought he'd never stop. And the rumors that fly around Moscow all the time, that a group of plans to free Ivan and put him on the throne instead of me. Never heard anything so ridiculous. The man's lost his brain. Paul stood and glanced at the clock. It was after midnight. He wondered what news there was of his mother and thought that he should go again to her apartment to see what, if anything, he could do. But an irritation nagged at him. The passage he had just read from his mother's diary made no mention of him at all. Yet he remembered how ill he had been on the day of her coronation, and how caring she had seemed about his welfare. There had been a St. Petersburg. He recalled that he had been ill even before they left there to travel to Moscow on the day before the coronation. There had been a great procession of more than 50 coaches and a difficult train to organize and halt. However, Catherine had intended to stop the whole procession when a doctor told her that her son's temperature was dangerously high. Paul had a clear image of a footman holding open the door of the coach for Catherine to clamber in to inspect his condition. She had put her palm on his forehead and taken his hand. "Come on, son," she said. "I need you with me at the cathedral, and air is what will seal it for me." Paul had no idea what these words meant at the time. He had taken them as kindly words from a caring mother. As an adult, though, he understood only too well. A public display of solidarity was good politics. Having her son by her side at her coronation would show the Russian people that there would be no problems about the succession when the time came. Paul had recalled standing near his mother. For ages the ceremony took. He was dizzy and he had to be supported by a lady in waiting who stood close. The cavernous cathedral, with its crowds of people, the glowing smell of the swimming censers, and the hypnotic effect of the chanted prayers made him more ill. He continually feared that he would be sick, for the whole time of the ceremony took. A cannon was fired across the square outside. The repeated explosions lent a kind of surrealistic atmosphere. Paul had not known what was real and what was not. Afterwards, he had spent nearly a week in his bed, the fever carrying his mind whatever it wanted. Paul only remembered the servants and the nurses coming and going in a haze of delirium and fever. His mother had not visited him at all. Moscow, February 2nd, 1763. If this is what it's like to be an empress, I'm not sure. I like it, power I may have, but the price is high. The treasury is empty, several regiments of the army haven't been paid for months, and Russia owes money to all over Europe, Italy, France, Britain. It seems there's hardly an ambassador who turns up to court these days who does not present Russia's debt to his country along with his credentials. And apparently, I must work here in Moscow, which has always seemed to me a place better seen from far away than experienced close up. It's chaos. The rubbish piled on the streets corners, the rats everywhere, the farm animals being driven through the streets to the market every day, the thousands of bells that never seem to stop ringing. Furthermore, the mayor tells me nothing is to be done about it without a great deal of money. I am not surprised Peter hated it to build Petersburg for his capital instead. Perhaps the only consolation for having to be empress is the letters I get from people. Voltaire has written to me. This is a real surprise and pleasure. I've also heard from Poniatowski. I remember him. He used to sit at the dinner table in St. Petersburg with Hanbury Williams. I will support his candidacy for the Polish throne. Paul was beginning to see through his mother. He too remembered Poniatowski, who had visited almost every week for years, until Paul realized Grigory Orlov had begun to play such a large part in his mother's life. There must have been more between Catherine and Poniatowski than she ever admitted, even in her diaries. He could see to that an alliance between Russia and Poland, with Russia in the controlling position, would be an enormous benefit, at least to Russia. The western borders would be safe. Poniatowski would get Russian support for his bid for the Polish crown. But what the Polish people would get from the deal were a lot less clear. Paul smiled a quiet, weary smile to himself. His mother had been an opportunist. She gave away a little but gained much, an adept politician. As for the fact that the treasury was empty, Paul found himself not surprised at all. Everyone understood that the war with Prussia had brought Russia close to bankruptcy. When Paul turned the page, he found their three folded letters tucked into the binding of the diary. He recognized the handwriting of two of them, although not from any of the documents he had read that day. He glanced at the signature, Panin. Paul must have seen this man's writing dozens of times on court documents and letters. He wondered what it was that Panin had written to his mother that was so confidential as to make her hide contents in secret compartments, yet sensitive enough to make her think the letters would be better among her own papers than stored among state documents archives. The third letter bore the crest of the Russian treasury. From Moscow to St. Petersburg, March 8, 1763. Madam, I have, as you commanded, much as an assessment of public opinion regarding Count Orlov's proposals of marriage. A quite large faction of the court supports the idea. Their view is that as a key army officer and your most loyal supporter, outside your immediate political advisory, Orlov is probably the best choice of husband your highness could make. It is also the case that many people are concerned about the continuing poor health of your son, Prince Paul. A union with Orlov would almost certainly produce a new heir to the throne, and so relieve anxieties about succession. On the other hand, and I must confess, madam, that my own feelings lie in this direction. Although Grigory Orlov carries the title of Count, he is not a member of nobility, and an heir born of this union would always meet oppositions. There would always be a question of legitimacy of succession. A future civil war between Prince Paul's supporters and supporters of any possible child of Orlov's would tear Russia apart. Also, we have not managed to entirely halt or even deflect the rumors about Alexei Orlov having had a hand in the Emperor Peter's death. A marriage between you and Grigory would link you to the death by association. I strongly advise that Your Highness does not place herself in such as a position. I include that Your Highness should turn away from any possible close association with any member of Orla family, and that marriage is wholly inadvisable. Panyan. Confidential Treasury Report, March 1763. Madam, your Treasury has concluded the study you ordered into possible remedies to questions of lack of financial resources. It's full of reports enclosed, but here I present the conclusion and primary recommendations. It is concluded by the Treasury Working Committee that only two remedies to lack of financial resources are possible within the time limits determined by Your Highness. The first is that Russia must begin a military operation against China. Border disputes have continued for more than 2 years now. We could use these as a reason to begin a war. The territory we gain and the people on it could be used to increase our produce and labor force and at no cost. It is estimated that the Russian government's treasury deficit could be made good within 3 years by this method. The second option is that Your Highness's Russian government could confiscate large areas of land within Russia, currently owned by Russian Orthodox Church. Each of these states, presently church-owned, contains hundreds of serfs. Nearly all these estates are highly profitable. About 1 million serfs could be brought under the government control in this way. It is estimated that the Russian government's deficit could be made good within 2 years by this method. Nikolai Kiretsky, Treasury Secretary. From St. Petersburg to Riga, July 5th, 1763. Madam, I ask that you return to St. Petersburg immediately. Ivan is dead, killed in his prison cell. It seems that a small group of guards opposed to Your Highness' rule were under the impression that if they freed Ivan, they would be allowed to install him as the Tsar. The escape was nearly successful. The sergeant of the guard on the duty at the time followed his orders under such circumstances that killed Ivan before being killed himself by the would-be recruits. Panyan. For Paul, that letters explained things he had wondered about for years. Several people had told him that Grigory Orlov had been pushed aside quite suddenly in 1763. Catherine must have told Panyan that she would take his advice, but she really done so. Catherine and Grigory had been very close for over 3 years, and Paul knew that even after his mother had become close friends with another man, Grigory remained at court as the military advisor and several governing committees. He had been foremost in planning the attacks against the Turks in 1769. Would this have been possible if there had been any kind of disagreement between them? Paul thought not. The acquisitions of church estates had continued for about a decade and had been bitter arguing point between Catherine and the Russian Church, which until then had been her strongest ally. Paul remembered an undignified shout match over the dining table in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg when he was perhaps 11 or 12 years old. His usual calm mother on her feet, stabbing the air with her forefinger to make her point, and the red-faced archbishop also standing leaning towards Catherine, angry and blustering. Paul already knew the way Ivan had died. Catherine, worried that she was beginning to gain reputation for being a ruler who had those she saw as political enemies murdered, made sure that the full facts of the case were published. However, not much else was on the record to be discovered about Ivan. Even Paul's careful historical research into his family history had relieved little. The Empress Elizabeth, and after her Catherine had quite successfully removed almost all references of his achievements from the political records. It was almost as though Tsar Ivan had not existed as a decision maker. Paul reflected that history itself was a far more carefully controlled thing than most people realized. Some figures became famous for things they did not do. On the other hand, although Paul grimly soon as deliberately made obscure, even though their deaths were worthwhile. End of chapter 6.